Hi, my name is Claudia McNulty. I use she and her pronouns, and I work as the Community Support Program Facilitator at the Integrated Care Hub in Kingston, Ontario. Today, I have the privilege of sharing with all of you on the topic of street life writ large, which is a crash course or a 101 course on street life and street culture, which is the culture that many of the people we serve are deeply immersed in as we provide services to them. People who work with people who use substances are, by virtue, providing services to people that are really deeply entrenched in street culture. And when we don't know very much about street culture, it puts us at a disadvantage in providing services to these folks. And having a better knowledge of what their day-to-day lives look like immersed in street life means that we have a better ability to connect and provide support services to these individuals. In this presentation today, I'm going to run through why we should know more about this topic, the labor and in particular the invisible labor of substance use and homelessness. I will also talk about the myth of choices, the impact of street life, both positive and negative, and how we can do better as service providers for these individuals. So how can we as service providers benefit from an increased knowledge about the culture that people who use substances are immersed in every day? Number one, it gives us an increased ability to connect with the people that we serve. In the last few years, social services have seen a real increase in the implementation of peer support models. These are models that prioritize hiring people with lived and living expertise in the realm of substance use, addiction, and homelessness, and it prioritizes hiring these folks to participate in the delivery of services. The reason we've seen an increase in this recently is because research tells us that people who are still experiencing homelessness and active addiction respond really well to supports and care from people who have been through similar experiences to them. And speaking for myself and for anyone else who doesn't come from this lived experience or expertise background, the best thing that we can do as service providers is open our minds and our ears to what street culture and this lifestyle looks like, so that even though we may never be able to say, I know what you're going through because I've been there, we can at least say, I've been listening, I know a little bit about this, how can I help you? Number two, we can dispel the illusion of choice. So if we understand the hardships and the obstacles that the people we serve are going through every single day by virtue of being involved in street culture, we can open ourselves to the idea that this really equity-deserving group of people often feels trapped in this lifestyle without a very clear path forward. And finally, we can work on actively resisting the recreation of shame in the people that we're working with. We as service providers, I think, are responsible for redirecting our energy and our fight from the people who are experiencing hardship due to street life to the ongoing structural oppression that continues to reproduce this culture in the first place. I think that we as service providers are also responsible for understanding that the people we work with experience crippling and undeserved shame at every intersection of their lives. And we as service providers can play a role in reinforcing this for them and being part of the problem or being part of the solution and fighting against that shame and stigma. This slide is called A Day in the Street Life, and this is an exercise that was created alongside people who are still experiencing street life and street culture to demonstrate the hardship in the day-to-day lives of people who use substances. And it's also to demonstrate that regardless of where you choose to exist as an unhoused person, you are not only subject to shame and stigma, but your wellness is repeatedly being compromised. Starting with waking up first thing in the morning. It is well known that sleep is absolutely foundational to wellness. If I don't have a good sleep for a night or a couple nights in a row, I know that I start to feel run down, which is how I feel now. I can also lose track of time and miss appointments or forget to send emails back. And I don't show up as the best version for myself, for my coworkers, my family, and my friends. And I would assume that this is a fairly universal experience. Now, I get to sleep in a bed every night. And for people that are potentially following the politician recommended route of accessing the shelter system, these folks are far more likely to experience sleep disruptions than the general public. Some of these sleep disruptions can include sirens caused by emergency vehicles, people who are on different sleep cycles, talking loudly through the night, or playing loud music. In some shelter settings, they also do safety checks on people while they're sleeping, which would involve a light being shone in their eyes every 5 to 10 minutes perhaps. So it's understandable that people are not getting a very restful sleep in the shelter setting. So, upon waking up and having probably a less than ideal sleep, folks then likely have to experience waiting in line just to use necessary facilities like a bathroom or shower. Then people have very little to no autonomy in what they may eat or what the first meal of their day may be, if there's anything served at all. And then people are usually expected to pack up all of their belongings if they're accessing the shelter system and take their belongings with them through their day, because most emergency shelters close during the daytime hours. Here's an important note though. All of the experiences that I just described are contingent on someone's capacity to wake up in the first place. Between dope sickness, mental illness, physical pain, or injury, there are days when people really struggle just to wake up and get out of bed at all, and I think that's important to acknowledge. While this next hypothetical is not the case for everyone, many people, as a result of a lack of available safe supply, will spend a large portion of the rest of their day trying to obtain the substances that make them feel well. If they're out of money to buy those particular substances in their day, this could potentially lead to people engaging in unsafe methods of making money in order to support their habit. If they are successful in doing so, because of the quite toxic available drug supply on the street, it's very possible that people who are using opioids will intend to use an amount of that substance to feel well and to get through the day, whether it be that they're hoping to connect with a housing worker, attend an appointment, or go see friends even. People end up being quite sedated and essentially poisoned and losing a really large portion of their day being unconscious. And if you've ever experienced hangover shame, you can only imagine how frustrating it would be to intend to just use enough of a substance to get on with your day and to feel good, and then to wake up 12, 14 hours later to find that your whole day has passed you by. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that this hypothetical person accessing the shelter system does everything right. They have an okay sleep, they get up and are able to use the facilities that they need to, they have breakfast, and their belongings are packed and ready to move on with their day. Unfortunately, the reality of being immersed in street life is that there are still all of these concerns to be worried about. So let's just take a minute and let this very long list of items sink in. Obviously, we as adults who potentially have jobs or dependents have a lot of the same concerns on this list as people that are unhoused and using substances, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge that the worry about some of these facets of our lives does not exist for us in the same way that it exists for people who are unhoused and using substances. For example, it's very normal and common, especially nowadays, for people of any walk of life, housed or not, to be concerned about money. Unexpected bills pop up, credit card bills can rack up a little bit, and it's normal that in situations like that we feel a little bit of anxiety. But for me, when I rack up a higher than usual credit card bill, I'm not worried for my physical safety, and I'm not worried that someone may physically assault me in the same way that unhoused people who are immersed in street life may be concerned about if they owe someone money. We also have to keep in mind that various intersections of someone's identity could also make some of these concerns far more daunting for them than for others. For example, a very, very common concern for unhoused people using substances to experience is a fear of law enforcement. So some of these fears may sound like, did I miss an appointment with my probation officer and now I'm going to be breached? Or am I going to be stopped by a police officer who will assume that I'm trafficking my substances or charge me for possession? Or am I going to be ticketed for loitering or trespassing somewhere that I'm not supposed to be? These are really common fears to be held by unhoused folks, but let's take a moment to think about how this might look different for a person of color who's using illicit substances. People of color who are aware of the dangers associated with law enforcement and racial profiling may experience this anxiety very differently from other people who are just using illicit substances, right? This is why I suggest that we keep in mind the intersecting identities that we encounter in our work and how marginalized folks' identities can make these concerns a lot harder to navigate and a lot bigger in their lives. Many of you, I'm sure, are also familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is an older model, but still very relevant, and it tells us that people are unable to reach self-actualization or thrive if they don't first have their basic physiological needs met, which can include food to eat, clean water to drink, shelter, clothing, and adequate rest. When someone is actively living in street culture and they're unhoused, we have to acknowledge that it's a reality for these folks that they don't know where those basic necessities are going to come from next. And living in this consistent state of stress about where they're going to sleep, what meal they're going to eat next, and where that's going to come from is not conducive to anyone's wellness. Now, chronic pain and the health effects of street life can be really shocking to people who haven't worked with people who use substances before. Living with pain and being unable to access adequate health care has to be one of the most devastating system failures that we see in the people we serve. Not only are the people we work with far more likely to experience illness and injury than the general public, but it's often reported by people that they feel a significant amount of shame and discrimination in the healthcare system that can sometimes lead to them not wanting to engage with that service at all. In addition to incurring more injury than the general public due to getting in fights, the conditions of living rough or sleeping in a tent, or experiencing physical or sexual violence, the community needs assessment conducted in 2021 also showed us that 90% of people experiencing homelessness have also incurred a traumatic brain injury or a TBI at some point in their lives, most of which have gone untreated. Head trauma affects so many aspects of daily life, including disrupting sleep patterns, impacting someone's ability to emotionally regulate, and also impacts their memory. And interestingly, but unfortunately, having experienced a traumatic brain injury in the past also puts people at a far greater risk of experiencing a drug poisoning. In addition to the pain associated with experiencing far more injuries and assaults, chronic illnesses and STBBIs, or sexually transmitted bloodborne infections, are also rampant in the people we serve who are living on the street. Some of these illnesses may have started many years ago, including in childhood, and then worsened due to the conditions of living on the street, and diabetes would be an example of this. Other illnesses come from the congregate living settings themselves, so things like COVID-19, MRSA, scabies, and respiratory viruses like RSV, we all see very often. Other conditions are primarily associated with unsafe substance use practices. These would be illnesses like HIV, hepatitis C, and endocarditis. Service providers also, interestingly, see a lot of dental complications in the people that we serve who are using substances, things like tooth abscesses, infections, rotting teeth, and a lot of pain in the general mouth region. What we've also seen is that many people would rather deal with this pain themselves than seek any sort of medical intervention to help. We're well aware at this point that many of the people we serve would rather self-manage their illnesses than seek help through the healthcare system. In the 2021 Rapid Assessment and Response Community Needs Assessment, someone said, "I'll go to the hospital, but I'll avoid it unless I'm dying," which I thought was a very telling and general perspective of the people we serve on the healthcare system. Finally, appointments can be really uniquely challenging for the people we serve as well, for all kinds of factors like inflexible scheduling, which isn't very accessible for people with cognitive impairments or substance use disorder. Also significant medical bills, especially in the dental side of things. And many, but not all, folks who completed that needs assessment, I'll reference lots of times, said that they had so many negative experiences in the healthcare system, they just avoid it entirely to avoid being further stigmatized. Now, what do we know to be a very effective way of managing pain, stress, and overwhelm? Substances. This is what I'm calling a Dope 101 slide, because I think as service providers, it's very helpful for us to have an idea of which substances people we work with are using, why they're choosing to use these substances, and also get an idea of what it's costing people to avoid the feeling of not having those particular substances. Folks who responded to the community needs assessment primarily described using drugs to cope with, like I said, pain and stress. And we know that substances have the capacity to really effectively reduce and manage both physical and emotional pain. What we also know is that sobriety is just objectively rare in our modern day society. If you are someone who has a drink after work or would smoke a joint with friends, you know how effectively substances can reduce the day-to-day discomfort that we all experience. It's just that some substances are far more stigmatized for all sorts of historical reasons we won't get into today. In Kingston, Ontario, these days, people that we work with are generally using crystal meth and street fentanyl. Every once in a while, we see people with crack or alcohol or hallucinogens as well. Some people may also be using drugs that were prescribed to them by a healthcare provider, but most commonly, we see fentanyl and crystal meth being used. The reason for this is because fentanyl, which is also called Fetty or Down and some other nicknames, is the cheapest synthetic opioid or painkiller available to folks right now, and crystal methamphetamine is the cheapest upper or stimulant. Fentanyl, which is an opioid and an extremely strong painkiller, causes feelings of intense euphoria and warmth and instant pain relief for people that are using this substance. It was deemed the drug of choice by 38% of respondents to the community needs assessment done in 2021. And someone was quoted in this assessment describing the use of fentanyl as feeling like God's hug every day, which I thought was interesting. People use fentanyl for all sorts of reasons, including sleep, managing dope sickness, managing chronic pain, and also sometimes for pleasure as well. On the other hand, being without this substance, if you are a regular user or you have a bit of a tolerance to fentanyl, the side effects of not having this drug are quite severe. This is what's called dope sickness, and it resembles extreme flu-like symptoms. So some of the symptoms described are vomiting, diarrhea, restlessness, sweating or clamminess, an inability to sleep, and pain through the whole body. And I think most importantly, the extreme mental distress of not having the substance as well. Crystal methamphetamine, which is a potent stimulant drug, was deemed the drug of choice or DOC by 44% of respondents to the community needs assessment. Interestingly enough, crystal methamphetamine is often used by people with ADHD as a form of self-medicating, and sometimes for people, the dependence on amphetamine started as early as childhood when they were prescribed Ritalin or Adderall, typically for young boys diagnosed with ADHD in an effort to manage their behavior or to improve their performance at school. For people with ADHD who are using crystal methamphetamine, the outcomes that they describe in using this drug are a mental clarity, alertness, an increased motivation to do things, and focus. For people without ADHD, we see a lot of hallucinations, but it's an upper, so it's a wake-up drug, it keeps you alert and motivated, and that's generally what we see. For people who use crystal meth very often, the feeling of not having this substance is something like pins and needles all over the body and a general discomfort in your skin or feeling like your skin is too tight. Another thing is that it does cause mental distress to not have this substance as well. Another important thing to note when we talk about crystal and fentanyl use is that both of these substances have unfortunately evolved over time to a worse version of themselves that have been compounded with fillers of all sorts of bad other substances, so they've made the supply far more toxic. Fentanyl is now very often laced with benzodiazepines and other relaxants that can cause people to be extremely sedated, and crystal meth is full of all sorts of other substances that are leading people to experience higher rates of psychosis and languishing than we were previously seeing in these drugs in the past. Now, let's take a look at this figure to see what these drugs that most people that we work with are using and how much they're costing people. Crystal meth is objectively less expensive than fentanyl, just based on the type of drug that it is. If you look closely at these numbers, you'll notice that people purchasing substances are often enticed by drug dealers to buy larger quantities of the substance, getting a bit of a deal on a larger quantity here, but this can potentially encourage them to use more of the substance, and it's more likely to cause them to be criminalized if they're stopped by law enforcement. The smallest unit of purchase for these substances is a point, which is 1/10 of a gram. And crystal meth has the unique terms associated with it of a 10-piece and a 20-piece, which is 1 point and 2 points respectively, while fentanyl almost exclusively uses the point, half ball, 8-ball language. Just an important distinction. Another important thing to note is that the cost of daily use of these substances can vary greatly from person to person, depending on their tolerance level and also their pain level if they're using opioids. So people can spend anywhere from $10 a day on their preferred substance, sometimes up to something like $150 a day on fentanyl if they have a really high tolerance level. This begs the very valid question, how are people paying for these drugs? There are lots of methods of obtaining money in street life and street culture. To run through a long list quite quickly, we have binning, boosting, theft, fraud, survival sex work, panhandling, and employment. Some of these income streams inherently carry more risk than others, and some of them are also more shame-inducing than others. Binning, if that's a new term for you, is the process of taking things out of garbage bins or dumpsters from companies and corporations and then selling these things for a profit. We also have boosting, which is theft from larger stores and companies. That way obviously carries quite a bit more risk of getting caught and incarcerated. The survival sex work is quite self-explanatory, and panhandling is also called panning. This is one of the more self-described shame-inducing forms of income for people that are unhoused. When I was developing this presentation with some people who are still experiencing homelessness, it was told to me that unhoused folks don't generally like to ask people for their hard-earned money. They're only doing so because they're in a really desperate situation. So it's important to know that people are making money in ways that don't always feel good for them. But employment is another great way for people that are unhoused to make money. I advocate for low barrier employment programs across social services because I think it's a fantastic opportunity for people to make money legally in a way that feels good for them, and it has all sorts of other positive outcomes if we give people the chance to work in a way that accommodates them. When we don't talk about legal employment, though, why are people engaging in all of these potentially risky forms of making money? Well, unfortunately, the general public does not usually get excited about the prospect of hiring people that don't have an address or who are still using substances. Again, that's why low barrier employment programs are a great idea, and why people are often trying to make money in ways that are either just inherently risky or illegal. Unfortunately, even if you are unable to work for really valid reasons, you still have bills to pay in street life and street culture. One's reputation among their peers and their credibility in being able to pay someone back for a debt that they owe is really informative of the way that their peers then treat them in the community. So people have described to me that it is absolutely essential that people are able to pay their debts back in a timely manner, because it can mean that you can tamper with the whole supply chain and that your peers may treat you much worse. Something that I've learned as well is that law enforcement can have a very seriously detrimental effect on people who are immersed in street life as they try to pay back their debts. For example, if someone is stopped and pulled over by the police and potentially arrested, it's not like the police ever give them a receipt to say that they took their cash and drugs that were on their person. So it can mean that someone is in a really bad situation of owing someone money afterwards. And people have been killed for drug debts, including in really small amounts. So it's a very dangerous business to be in, and it's not one that people usually choose. The last thing that I'm going to talk about on this slide is the hidden cost associated with homelessness. So we talked about drugs, and that's one thing, but there are also all these other expenses that unhoused people have that I think a lot of people don't know about. One thing would be their partner's addiction. Some people that are involved in a relationship where one person isn't able to work and get their own money, but that are still addicted to substances. Sometimes it means that one partner is supplying for both people. People also have pets while they're experiencing homelessness. People have to buy dog food or cat food. Then we have things like transportation, which can be cab fare or purchasing bicycles. We have cell phones, clothing that makes you feel dignified, and camping gear as well. Not even to mention the cost of replacing these things when they are damaged or stolen, which happens all the time. Now, let's explore how decriminalization put into practice would interrupt the negative impacts of street life on the people that we serve. What I've learned from attending various probation meetings, court hearings, and just chatting with folks that I work with is that the criminal justice system comes down really hard on people who use substances, and it's a really, really hard cycle to get out of. Given all of the challenges that we've already discussed in living day to day immersed in street life, can we imagine how challenging it would be to obtain a lawyer while you're detained or when you're out and staying on the street? Or how challenging it might be to keep track of when your probation meetings are? Or when you feel like you're being targeted by law enforcement for previous charges and that they're profiling you? It's a mess, very hard to deal with for people. The community needs assessment learned that 90% of males and 73% of females that are unhoused have experienced incarceration at some point, and most of this is due to drug-related charges. Serving time is not only extremely detrimental to one's overall wellness, but also to their sense of self-esteem and self-value. When we criminalize addiction by charging people for simple possession of substances, we reinforce to people over and over again that their struggle with substance use disorder is bad and that it's their fault and that it's worthy of punishment. We also know that punishment as a model to get people to abstain from using substances doesn't generally work as effectively as holistic models or positive reinforcement do. The decriminalization of substances would also really effectively reduce the trauma that incarceration causes folks, especially young people. When paired with safe supply, it could prevent additional petty crime to support the habit. It would discredit the shame that is induced when people are arrested and detained as well. If these two things, decriminalization and a safe supply program, were paired effectively, we could encourage people to sever the relationship with their drug dealer and instead start building really meaningful relationships with the healthcare providers who would be prescribing their daily use substances. Last thing that I want to share is that someone told a coworker of mine once that in their mind, decriminalization would be like a promise, saying you will live, you will not go to jail, you're okay, and there is nothing wrong with you. So, in the first couple minutes of this presentation, I talked about there being a myth of choice around using substances and experiencing homelessness. I hope through describing some of the barriers that the people we work with experience on a day-to-day basis, I've painted a picture of how individual freedoms and autonomy don't exist for the people we serve in the same way that it exists for us. Let's now talk about an example of a situation that you may run into in your personal life that mirrors the experience of something that people using substances might go through. We chatted about dental pain a little bit before, right? So imagine you wake up one day with very severe pain in one of your back teeth, worse than you've ever felt before. What are the go-to options, or what choices do we have available to us in situations like that? Number one, you could choose to take some Tylenol or Advil if you have it at home and see if that fixes the situation for you. If that doesn't work and the pain persists over time, we then have the choice and option to call a dentist and book an appointment to be seen later in the week. Or if the pain is so severe and we don't want to wait to go see a dentist, we may be able to access a hospital emergency room to be seen more quickly. Now I want to encourage all of you to consider if these choices exist in the same way for the people who we serve who may be using substances. Because from what I've heard, many methods that we would use in a situation like this wouldn't play out or work in the same way for these folks. For example, is Tylenol or Advil a really feasible pain management option when you're potentially accustomed to like a street supply of fentanyl? Probably not. Probably wouldn't touch the pain that you're experiencing. Are you likely to have a dentist that you can go see? Or are you able to make the appointment times or pay for the bill from the dentist if they do help fix the situation for you? And finally, if someone chose to access an emergency room, are they likely to be treated with respect and dignity and not made to feel embarrassed about the situation that they're in? Also, maybe not. While I'm grateful that I haven't personally experienced this in my career, I do have coworkers who have been in the field for longer and have seen people in this exact situation. And what has often played out in the past is that these folks would rather pull their own teeth out than seek help through any of those options available because they just don't seem like viable solutions for them at the time. Now, the impact of living immersed in street culture is very complex, and it affects different people very differently. Going back to the marginalized and intersecting identities, we see that street life is much crueler and harsher to some people than it is to others, and the culture also disproportionately pulls in people of these marginalized identities, such as Indigenous folks. But what I can say across the board for this community is that every single person who we work with who is using substances is experiencing shame. Our society tends to treat the homeless drug addict as the lowest tier human in our society, and this is reinforced not only through the healthcare system, like I just said, but through the housing system, through the criminal justice system, and through the job market. And these are big picture structures as well that leak into all different aspects of our daily lives. Now, how are any of the clients that we work with supposed to gather enough self-worth and propel themselves forward in conditions like this when they're treated not very well at every intersection? When people are treated poorly, they feel poorly, and very often they act poorly as a result. And they cope in the ways that are available to them. This is where we see like a real chronic hopelessness start to brew very often because there are so few services available to people where they can predictably be treated with respect and dignity. That being said, when you are treated poorly in every sector of society that you encounter, you will naturally gravitate towards people who not only understand what you've been through, but you will seek a community that can fill the gaps in the resources that you've been denied previously. This is where we start to see people having like a chosen family in street life. And this is something that people feel very often from the chosen family in this culture. They feel a sense of love and acceptance. They can receive protection from people who might want to harm them. And there's also like a reasonable sharing and splitting of resources as well. So this can be sharing food or exchanging clothes or letting someone stay in your tent for a night if they don't have another place to go. And what's the alternative to partaking in street life if you're experiencing homelessness? What is the real path to housing and to get your life back on track, as people like to say? The reality is, people we work with are asked to abstain from substances, to follow the shelter-oriented routine of daily activities, and they're expected to save their money for potentially months to save up for first and last month's rent. But what comes after that? We know that the Ontario Disability Support Program and Ontario Works, or ODSP and OW, which are the most common government support systems, pay people far less than what is needed to live, and it sets people far below the poverty line in their daily life. And I'm sure if any of you work in the social services sector, you know that this is a really uncomfortable goal to be projecting onto the people we work with, and it's not a very good feeling to tell people to strive for this quality of life. Some other options work for some groups of people, but not others. Transitional housing is a really great option for some folks, but for other people, it can leave them feeling managed or treated because of a set of rules that aren't very realistic for adults, such as having a really strict curfew or not being allowed to have visitors. So while I think transitional housing options are fantastic, we need more than that available because it just doesn't work for everyone. So how can we work on this? How can we do better? The ways in which that we can start doing better as service providers, number one is to follow the third principle of harm reduction. And I'm going to read this so I get it right. This principle says, establishing quality of individual and community life and well-being, not necessarily cessation of all drug use, as the criteria for successful interventions and policies. And I'll say it one more time. Establishing quality of individual and community life and well-being, not necessarily cessation of all drug use, as the criteria for successful interventions and policies. When we release the expectation that substance users must be abstinent from all drugs in order to move through the housing system, we tell people that their quality of life and stability and happiness is more important than their sobriety, which we should tell people because, I said it before, sobriety is just objectively rare, and we shouldn't project this onto people to say that they deserve the necessities of life. If we are able to successfully redirect our energy from drugs are the enemy to housing models that don't accommodate people who use drugs are the enemy, we are aligning ourselves with the principles of harm reduction and prioritizing the lives of substance users. Finally, we can do better by observing intersectionality within street life and try to understand what systems of oppression push certain people towards this way of living. Doing so can mean that we can be more kind, compassionate service providers. And that's really what we're all going for, right? To be better versions of ourselves and to try to be the version of ourselves that can create the most kind, compassionate, and meaningful relationships with the people that we're here to support. Thank you for listening.